Welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs in what is an unusual and very special session. It's a joint session between the Institute for Contemporary Affairs, our Institute for Diplomacy, and the Global Law Forum. And clearly the subject matter at hand is very serious and one which has claimed an enormous amount of attention in the international legal discussion and legal community, as well as the international diplomatic community and, of course, the media at large. And that is the discussion of the IDF and Operation Cast Lead, some ethical issues. I can't think of a person more appropriate to inform us and teach us, enlighten us as to some of these issues than Professor Asa Kasher. As some of you know, Professor Kasher was the author of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces Code of Ethics, which was published in 1994 and published by the IDF under then Defense Minister and today's Defense Minister, Ehud Barak. Professor Kasher is the Laura Schwartz Kipp Professor of Professional Ethics and Philosophy of Practice and Professor of Philosophy at Tel Aviv University. And his research covers a very broad range of topics, both in philosophy and ethics, including military ethics, medical ethics, and the philosophy of language, as well as issues of Jewish identity. Professor Kasher was a recipient of the Itzhak Zadeh Prize for Military Literature and Military Ethics, and in 2000 was awarded the Israel Prize for his work in philosophy and ethics. Notably, Professor Kasher was a member of the committee to recommend the ethical code both for the government and for the Knesset. For the government, the committee's recommendations were made in 2008, and the government and the Knesset recommendations were in 2006. So clearly, we're really very blessed and honored, Professor Kasher, that you've joined us, and clearly this is a subject of great import. I just wanted to note to you, hot off the press by the Global Law Forum itself, is a policy book that just arrived this morning, which is an expanded version of Ambassador Gold's presentation during his debate with Justice Richard Goldstone at Brandeis University. It's available to all of you. We have it outside when you get up after the presentation and discussion, as well as one other important booklet on the campaign to delegitimize Israel with the false charges of apartheid, which is written by the former legal counsel to the Foreign Ministry, Dr. Rabbi Sable. So having said that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Professor Kasher, who will make a presentation, and we'll have our discussion.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for your friendly introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to the Jerusalem Center for having invited me. I'll discuss several aspects of the Cast Lead operation, but I'd like to do it on a more general background, namely the way we should evaluate a military operation or a war, evaluate it morally or ethically. There are different kinds of evaluations. There is a diplomatic one, a political one, a professional one. I'm interested in the moral and ethical aspects. Now, a moral evaluation of an operation or a war is naturally divided into two. First, we are interested in the answer to the question why, and then we are interested in the answer to the question how. Those are two separate questions. They belong to two different echelons of the governmental body. I mean, the decision to wage a war or start a military operation is made by the government, by the politicians, by the civilians in a democracy such as Israel, whereas activities in the field, the how, is being answered by the activities of a military force, the IDF. There is a long tradition, long philosophical tradition, even theological tradition, because it starts with St. Augustinus and St. Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic thought, but it is still binding everyone. There is a distinction between those two levels, and the government is not to be blamed for the behavior of the soldiers, and the soldiers should not be blamed for the decisions made by the government, and so there is a distinction there. I'd like to say a few words about the government and then to move to the behavior of the soldiers, which is my expertise. When you ask why why did the government make a decision to carry out an operation such as Operation Castled, then you invoke traditional, ordinary principles that all belong to the so-called just war tradition. There is a theological and philosophical and legal tradition of just war, and it includes a variety of principles. Let me mention very briefly just 3 of them. First of all, there is the principle of the right of self-defense. If you are attacked, you are the state, or you are the citizens of a state. If you are attacked, you are under an attack, you have the right to defend yourself. From an external point of view, namely from the point of view of the relationships between different states, different organizations, you have the right to defend yourself against the attack of someone. However, from an internal point of view, namely from the point of view of the relationships between the government and its citizens, you have a duty of self-defense, not just a right. The government, the state, has the duty to defend by waging a war if you can solve it in a different manner. Because war involves casualties, both on your part and on the other side of the battlefield. And if those casualties can be avoided, they should be avoided. So if a problem can be solved without resort to military force, it has to be solved in this way. Now, I'm not a member of the cabinet. The Israeli cabinet. I don't know exactly what went on during their deliberations. But I think that if you look at a period of 8 years, right, 8 years gives you a very strong presumption that that was last resort. It was not immediately after the first Qassam that hits the rock that we started Operation Castled. It took place 8 years later. Now, why did we wait for 8 years? The simple answer is because we tried all kinds of other methods for solving that problem. And both military methods and political methods, the Tahadiyya and other methods, and they all failed. So when they all failed and you are left with just one method for trying to solve the problem, then you are allowed, according to just war doctrine and international law, to use force, to use military force. It was last resort, presumably. Now there is a third ingredient, the third principle in just war doctrine, just war theory, tradition, that I'd like to mention. There must be a reasonable chance for gaining victory. This is the traditional way of putting the principle forward. I mean, you don't kill people, both on your side and on the other side, for symbolic gestures of being brave or being independent. There must be a chance for gaining victory. If there is no chance for gaining victory, it's a bloodshed. It's a mere bloodshed, and it should not take place. Now, is there a chance to gain victory when we face the Hezbollah or the Hamas? That's a question that should be reconsidered. And that's the first ingredient, the first case in my paper where I'd like to point out the difference between the classical wars and present-day wars, and the so-called new wars. I mean, in World War II, there was a chance to gain victory. I mean, both the Allies and the other parties, they had a chance of gaining victory. If you see the end of the war, if you see the battles that led to the end of the war, if you see what happened at the beginning of the war, when Germany had the upper hand, then, okay, the parties had a chance of gaining victory. Gaining victory in a war like World War II, or in the War of Independence, or Yom Kippur War, Six-Day War, I mean, a victory means that there is no military danger anymore. We destroyed the other military force, and hostilities conducted by military force are not to take place for a while, for a long while, for as long as it takes to rebuild a military force. Okay, so it's a total victory. Now, when you face militias whose mode of operation is terroristic, which means that they just want to send a Katyusha from Lebanon, or send a Qassam from Gaza, since in order to send a missile, or to send a rocket, what you need is just 2 persons, a primitive device for launching them, and a cellar full of those rockets or Katyushas, then it can take forever. You can stay there for months and kill many of them or capture many of them, and still, when you withdraw, you're going to get Qassams on your head or Katyushas on your head, as we saw in the Second Lebanon War. So total destruction of the other party is something which is not what is required for gaining victory, so to speak. Now victory means something less. Present day wars, victory in them is accomplishing your reasonable missions. You have a mission to significantly improve the security situation of the southern part of Israel. If you can accomplish that mission, then that's it. That's what a principle requires. So if you look at those three conditions, I mean, Operation Cast-Led indeed fulfilled them. There are others, but I don't want to discuss them presently, because I'd like to move to the other question, namely, how was Operation Cast-Led conducted? Was it done appropriately? Now there is within Israel, there is a question posed frequently, namely, is the IDF the most moral force on earth? All right, Israelis like discussing that kind of issue. Now, I take the question seriously, not because I'm interested in competing with Canada or the United States or the UK, because I'm interested in the manner in which you evaluate the moral standards of a military force. Not the moral standard of a certain person under certain circumstances, but the moral standards of a huge body, a huge organization like a military force, like the IDF, or the Marines, or the Army, who are active in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US Marines and Army. Actually, there are 3 different questions that should be raised, that can be discussed. One is the fundamentals, the moral fundamentals, the basic values on which the military force acts. Usually military forces have codes of ethics that put forward certain values as the values of those military forces, and you can compare those sets of values. You can discuss the values that appear in different documents of different military forces. Then there is another level on which you find regulations, rules of engagements, commands. They are, so to speak, translations of the values and principles to a more practical level. The values are abstract. Rules of engagement are very concrete. They tell the troops when to shoot and when not to shoot. Okay, so they're very, very concrete. Then there is another level of the behavior of the troops. I mean, what actually did they do under certain circumstances? So you cannot give an answer, a flat answer to the question, is this a moral military force or the most moral military force? You have to work on each of those levels separately. So let me say a few words about those levels. If you look at the fundamentals, the basic moral fundamentals, they rest on 3 feet. First of all, the values of the IDF. There is a document, the spirit of the IDF, which enumerates the values. Then there is international law as much as it applies to the present situation. And then there are doctrines that tell us how to behave under different circumstances. The values of the IDF are impeccable, as are the values of the US Army and Marines and Navy and Air Force and British values. If you look at documents, at military ethics in the West, in the Western democracies, the documents are perfect. I mean, they demand what should be demanded by a military force in a democratic state. We have, for example, a basic value of protection of human dignity. Protection of human dignity means that every human person has dignity that should be protected by everyone all the time. I mean, even the worst terrorist is a human being, and we think about protecting his human dignity. How do we protect the human dignity of a terrorist? by having considerations as to whether to kill him or capture him, or leave him alone. Okay, the fact that we think about the question whether we can capture him or not, or rather kill him, then that shows that we respect that person's human dignity. Because if we can capture him, then we are going to capture him and not kill him. We don't kill a person that we can capture, whom we can capture. And that's human dignity, even of terrorists, let alone other ones. And we have a value of, thank you very much, we have a value of the sanctity of human life. Human life, both of our troops and our citizens and other human beings. I mean, they are precious, and presumably they shouldn't be harmed. Then we have a value called in Hebrew, when you translate it literally from Hebrew, it's called the purity of arms, which means actually the purity of the usage of arms. So it's a value of self-restraint. You have force, you have your arms, you can use them in different ways. Use them in a very restrained way, namely for accomplishing your missions, and nothing more than that. I mean, anything you do with your gun, which is not for defending the citizens by accomplishing your specific mission, is wrong. And it's improper and immoral and shouldn't take place. So if you look at the values of the IDF, there is no code of ethics on earth, and all the democracies do publish their code of ethics. It's not classified. There is no code of ethics which is better than the code of ethics of the IDF. And there are people in the West, I cannot join them because I was involved in writing it. There are people in the West, numerous people in the West, who say that our code of ethics is the best. Undoubtedly, it's second to none, but I would say even more. It's the first. Particularly because protecting human dignity, sanctity of human life, and purity of arms appear nowhere else in other codes of ethics. Though other democracies are interested to the same extent that we are interested in protecting human dignity. It's the first clause in the German Constitution. Of course they are interested in it, and in the sanctity of human life and restraining the force. Okay. The second ingredient, the fundamental ingredient, is international law. Now, international law traditionally rests on the just war doctrine. International law is something devised in the 17th century by the Dutch lawyer Hugo Grotius, on grounds of a very long philosophical and theological tradition, so-called the just war doctrine. And then it took the shape of conventions, ICRC conventions, the Hague, Geneva, and protocols and others that are all on grounds of the principles of just war doctrine. The most famous principles are those of distinction, or discrimination, sometimes they call it, that of proportionality and military necessity, and other ones. However, let me say it very clearly, it's a major issue concerning Operation Cast Lead, but also concerning Second Lebanon War. Strictly speaking, there is no international law concerning situations that we encountered in Second Lebanon War and Operation Cast Lead. Strictly speaking. International law was devised for classical wars. If you think about distinction, I mean, they were meant to guide the military forces of states, where all the troops bear uniforms. They all carry their guns openly. They all act in an organization that looks like a military force, with commanders and hierarchy and regulations, and they all under the government of a civil government of a certain state. Now, what we face since the early years of 2000 is something else. It's in the early 2000 years, we faced the Palestinian terrorist organizations acting, say, from the West Bank. Now, it's an organization, it's not a state. They act from a territory which is a political entity. The Palestinian Authority is a recognized political entity. However, it's not a state. So you don't face a state, you face an organization acting from an entity which is not a state. That's not a classical war, where you face a military force that is guided by a state. Then if you think about the Second Lebanon War, then we faced a militia of a terrorist militia that acts from southern Lebanon. Lebanon is a state, does have a government, does have a military force, but nevertheless the Hezbollah do whatever they like from southern Lebanon. So you have an organization which is a militia, and they act from a state, from the territory of a certain state. That's a completely different situation. There is a state there, there is a government there, there is a military force there. Then if you look at the Operation Castled, we face another militia. It's terroristic militia as well. They act from a territory which is a political entity, the Palestinian Authority, but it's not a state. The Palestinian Authority is not a state, and they actually are the government. They are the government of the area. They govern the area, and that's still a third possibility. Now, I hope there is not going to be a third Lebanon war, but assume there is a third Lebanon war in the near future, then again it will be of a fourth kind, because the Hezbollah are now a party that participates in the government. So it's not just an organization, perhaps an insurgent organization acting from the southern part of Lebanon. It's a party that has representative in the parliament and in the government of the state of Lebanon. So part of the government sends rockets over you. It's a completely new situation. So now saying that there is international law guiding us concerning those kinds of situation is very problematic, to put it mildly. It's very problematic. Now, how should we solve the problem? That international law, as we are familiar with, was meant for the classical wars, and now we have to apply it, something like it to new kinds of wars. So there are two ways of reply. One is the so-called creative interpretations. Okay, you have the regulations, the principles that are meant for classical wars, and you reinterpret them in a creative manner. Okay, lawyers, judges know how to interpret creatively when they have to do it. But it remains very problematic if we resort to the idea of creative interpretation. Whose interpretation? Whose interpretation is it going to be? The interpretation of the Supreme Court of Israel? The interpretation of the Supreme Court of the US? The interpretation of the JAG of the Marines? The interpretation of someone in the United Nations? The interpretation of the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations? I mean, their interpretation? Whose interpretation is it going to be? And why should any interpretation be binding on us? Assume we have our interpretation. Now, all kinds of criticism against our creative interpretation would be very problematic. I mean, why should we accept your creative interpretation? We are not within the framework of a state where there is a Supreme Court who made the final decisions. I mean, we are in the world where there is, okay, just creative interpretations here and there. So why should we act on someone else's creative interpretation? Our method is, in a sense, different. We are interested in extending international law, not coming up with creative interpretations, but extending it. The Prime Minister spoke a few weeks ago, our Prime Minister spoke a few weeks ago about changing international law. And some people misunderstood him to mean that we want to cross out some principles and introduce other principles instead. I mean, that is not the idea. The idea is not to change in the sense of crossing out and introducing something new. The idea is extending it. There are gaps, major gaps in international law, and presently we are active within those gaps. Those gaps are what we faced in the terrorist organizations of the early 2000s and in Second Lebanon War and Operation Castled. And in case we have to face the Hamas or the Hezbollah again, we are within that gap. So we are interested in extending international law, which means creating new principles in the spirit of the just war doctrine, in the spirit of international law, but it's just in the spirit. which means paying respect to very fundamental principles, not acting according to a certain clause in a certain convention of the ICRC. So that's our, that is or should be our method. Actually, what has been done by Major General Amos Yadlin and myself is to put forward an ethical doctrine, a document that is a doctrine for fighting terrorists in different circumstances, and what should be, it's a first step toward extending international law. What should be done in addition to using our doctrine is to write it down as an extension of international law, present-day international law, whether the conventions or the additional protocols or whatever. Major General Yadlin and myself, we started working on it in 2003 in a team of the College of National Security. At that time, Amos Yadlin was the commander of the college, the other colleges of the IDF. Now he is the chief of intelligence of the IDF. We published it in a scholarly journal with all the arguments. The journal is called the Journal of Military Ethics. We published it in 2005. The editorial board immediately invited 3 philosophers to comment on our work, on our paper, on our doctrine. One of them, 2 were Americans. One was a Lebanese philosopher who wrote a very polite and scholarly and beautiful paper against our paper. I mean, against, as philosophers are used to, I mean, they hardly agree with each other on anything. So he disagreed with us on certain points, which was very legitimate, and we don't blame him for anything. It's just philosophical argument. And we presented it to the Chief of Staff, to the head of the General Security Service, and to many others. And when you listen to the way colonels or lieutenant colonels taking part in Operation Cast Lead describe their activities, then you hear our principles. They're not classified. You can read it. You can I can send you the paper, a file with the paper if you're interested. Now let me give you a few examples of what happens in our doctrine. First of all, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, where combatants are in uniform and carrying their guns openly, and all the others are non-combatants, that's gone. That's impossible, because most of the time, almost all the terrorists are not wearing uniform, are not bearing their gun openly. On the contrary, exactly the contrary. So what we need is a scale of involvement in terroristic activity. We replace the distinction by a scale of involvement. And there are people who are directly involved, there are people who are indirectly involved, and people who are not involved at all. People who are not involved at all or indirectly involved are never going to be the targets in a targeted killing operation. Only people who are directly involved. And even they, only if there is an imminent danger. And if they they play a major role in creating that imminent danger. So the targeted killing operations that have been performed according to our doctrine are carried out when it's necessary to stop a certain operation against the citizens of Israel, when the role played by the target is crucial to the operation, and it's never punishment and never meant for deterrence. I mean, it's future-oriented, it's not past-oriented. So it's not punishment. They don't punish people by killing them. The only body that can punish people is the court. And you don't punish people by killing them by a helicopter and a missile. So this is meant just to stop them for a certain activity in which they are engaged. And it's not deterrence. We have a principle in our doctrine that says the deterrence is a byproduct of operations. You cannot kill people for deterrence. You can do something that involves killing people, and then it has a byproduct of deterring the other party from resorting to the same kind of activities. We killed Yassin because he was involved in pushing the terroristic button. Immediately after that, they appointed Rantisi, and immediately after that, we killed him. Now, we didn't kill Rantisi just to show them to deter them, just to show them that we know their whereabouts. We killed him because his finger was on the button. And if we hadn't killed him, then there would be casualties in Israel. Would have been casualties in Israel. So it was facing a danger, not punishing for past crimes. Now, that's one example. And every example I give, if you want to discuss, ask questions, make remarks, I mean, feel free to do it. Another example is that usually there is the whole distinction between combatants and non-combatants is something that we don't like, because it led people to think that the life of combatants is cheap, whereas the life of non-combatants is precious, is sacred. So there are people who express their views in terms of combatants are instruments, they're instruments. We beg to differ. In particular in Israel, where most of those who took part in Operation Cast Lead were conscripts or reserve officers. I mean, they are there because they have to be there. Because we tell them that they have a duty, even a legal duty, to be there. And we cannot say that they are instruments. They are citizens of the state. And their blood is as red and as precious as the blood of everyone else. And we are allowed to jeopardize their life by sending them to face a terrorist. But we are not allowed to consider them to be instruments, dispensable instruments. They are not. They're human beings. They have human dignity. It should be protected. And they can be sent to carry out military missions. Now, so we draw a distinction between situations. Sometimes troops face combatants, only combatants. That's easy. We know there are the norms in the conventions. Sometimes troops face only non-combatants, a village, a Palestinian village, innocent Palestinian village, innocent in the sense of not dangerous. We know what to do, namely nothing. We shouldn't hurt them. But then there is a third situation, which in the classical wars was the exception. Now, presently, it is the regular situation, namely that they are mixed. That you face a mixture of both people who are dangerous to your citizens and people who are not dangerous. Okay, so what should be done under such mixed circumstances? International law and just war doctrine, it's called the double effect doctrine, they allow us to cause collateral damage in a certain restrained way. We are allowed to cause collateral damage. The conception of military necessity, the term military necessity applies in international law to mark exactly those situations where there is a military necessity to kill civilians, non-combatants. Why? Because they are neighbors of combatants who must be killed in order to accomplish the important military mission. So there is a military necessity to hurt the innocent. That's the conception of military necessity. So we are allowed, everyone admits that, we are allowed to hurt people who are innocent. Not intentionally, but knowingly. We know in advance that the neighbor of the terrorist is going to get killed. However, we don't intend to kill him. We just know that he's going to be killed. We have to make efforts, every effort reasonable, possible, to have as little collateral damage as possible. And we have to be proportional. I'll return to proportionality later. Notice that those principles apply not only to military activity. Think about what happens when there is a danger to the life of a pregnant woman. Okay, think about a case where the only way to save her life is by doing something that would kill the fetus. Okay, we do it, except Catholics who do not, for their religious, theological reasons. Everyone else does it. Because we do not intend to kill the fetus. On the contrary, if we have a way to save the life of both of the woman and the fetus, we would resort to it. But there is none. So we know in advance that there is a very great danger to the life of the fetus. but nevertheless we're going to save the life of the woman, although the price is going to be the life of the fetus. So it's not something tailored to military activities, it's everywhere, that principle, the double effect doctrine. Okay, now let me say a few words about the effort to minimize collateral damage. We have a principle in our doctrine that says when you can warn, you must warn the non-combatants that they are going to become residents of a neighborhood where it's dangerous to stay. We resorted to methods of warning that had never been used under such circumstances. We distributed millions of leaflets. We made more than 150,000 phone calls. Phone calls. Just imagine the intelligence project that requires getting the phone numbers and knowing that that's the phone number of a certain family on the second floor of the third house in the 4th street. Okay, we have to know how to do it. Now we took all the trouble of creating the possibility of warning them by phone calls. And we made numerous phone calls. Then we have a method called knock on the roof. The troops call it knock on the roof. There is some formal name, but it doesn't matter. The knock on the roof means that the leaflets are distributed days earlier. Phone calls are made hours earlier. Knock on the roof is done minutes earlier. I mean, it's a certain missile, it's non-lethal, it doesn't kill anybody, it's very noisy, it's a real hint, okay? You hear it very well. Now, we mean business. It's a matter of minutes until we send something to destroy the house or the apartment or the cellar or whatever. Be warned. Now, most of those methods are effective in the sense that you see by your intelligence means that the people leave the place, and whether something else should be done after they left, I'll speak about it briefly in a minute. Now, I'd like to say a few. Three more points and I'll finish. I'd like to say something about proportionality. This notion has never been explicated clearly. I mean, nobody knows what proportionality means. We know what proportionality means only under extreme circumstances. If military advantage is huge and collateral damage is small, then it's justified. If military advantage is marginal, not zero, but marginal, and collateral damage is extensive, it's forbidden. But most of the time, we don't know how to compare military advantage and collateral damage. And if we don't know how to compare them, let's assume they're equal. Let's assume they're equal. Now, what should a state do when what it gains from the military activity in terms of defending its citizens is equivalent to the collateral damage it causes on the other side? There is in Hebrew saying, the poor of your town come first. Okay? I mean, if there are two people who are poor, and you can help just one of them. I mean, ideally you can help both, but circumstances are so that you can help just one of them. So then the poor of your town comes before the poor of another town, of the neighboring town. Think about if you can save just one man from, one woman from drowning. Okay, you can save just one. Okay, whom would you save if one of them is your brother and another one is a stranger? Would you be blamed for saving your brother first? The answer is not. So when there is an equivalence, I mean, when on all other terms the conditions are the same, then you opt for what is smaller, what is closer to you, where the gap is smaller. Now, one should understand that the way the term proportionality has been employed in public discourse by politicians and journalists and others is usually wrong. It has nothing to do with numbers. Proportionality has to do with whether the military advantage justifies the collateral damage. The numbers are not crucial here. If there is a rocket on some slope, because there are more people on the roof than in the target. Okay. Why is their blood redder than ours? You are our government, right? And it's not, very importantly, which is ignored by many, and which is also within the nature of those new wars. You don't compare, you don't do considerations locally. You have to do it globally. If you think locally, then here is one building. Assume that on the roof there is just one sniper and many non-combatants. Now, one sniper cannot cause much danger. Okay, one sniper can kill every few minutes one person. Now, if the sniper kills one person, if you kill the sniper, then all the non-combatants on the roof get killed. So in order to save one person, you kill all the persons on the roof. People tell you, well, that's disproportional, right? That's disproportional. However, is it disproportional? Let us look at it globally. If I'm not allowed to hit the sniper on the roof, whose non-combatant neighbors join him on the roof, then we are not allowed to act against any sniper on any roof, because all the snipers on all the roofs are going to be accompanied by non-combatants, which means that they have a method for using the snipers or the rocket launchers or whatever without us having a way to defend ourselves. That's unacceptable. Nothing in the circumstances of military affairs can be tantamount to a state not being able to defend itself. Giving up the duty and giving up the right. So we have to understand that proportionality is a matter of justification of the military advantage in terms of in comparison with the collateral damage. Now, finally, when we made a series of warnings, when we used a series of warning operations, warning methods, then still there are some people, if any one of you reads the New York Review of Books, then the point was made by two writers in the New York Review of Books who attacked our doctrine. I mean, perhaps some people are still there in the house that you face. You distributed leaflets, you made phone calls, you see that many people left, you use the practice of knock on the roof, but who knows, perhaps there is still someone there. And in one of their examples was someone who has not left his apartment because he's afraid that the carpets are going to be stolen. If he leaves, okay. Now, under such circumstances, should we send in troops in order to find out whether there are people there in addition to the terrorists or not? So our doctrine says not. Do not send troops. Because the mixture of terrorists and non-combatants is a mixture not under our responsibility in a territory that we don't have effective control over. We don't have effective control over Gaza. We do have effective control over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and many other places. So there, we do jeopardize the life of police persons when they have to solve criminal problems. They endanger themselves when they try to capture the criminal without hurting one's neighbors. That's the duty. However, this mixture is not under our effective control. We are not responsible to it, and we don't have to pay the price for the authorities of that place maintaining such a mixture. And we have warned them. We have warned them. Moreover, they can raise a white flag. If they do raise a white flag, the situation changes, and perhaps we are going to do something with all kinds of our means in order to save those who are there, want to leave, but cannot. Say, a sick person who cannot leave, okay, in a matter of minutes. So let him raise a white flag, and then we'll treat the whole situation differently. So we say that you don't have to jeopardize the life of the troops. If you look at non-combatants in a territory where we don't have effective control, and we have already made a series of warnings that we know have been effective, then the life of our troops comes first under such circumstances. So to conclude, if we, two brief remarks, if we compare the IDF to moral standards, to adequate moral standards on the level of values, on the level of doctrines, I think they are quite okay. They are second to none. If we look at the level of operation, what actually took place under the circumstances, we have all kinds of indirect evidence. If in the discussion I'll mention two major examples. Should we investigate activities of the troops during the Operation Castle? Undoubtedly. Every professional, every person in charge of a professional organization has to investigate its organization's activities. It applies to a physician after an operation. It applies to an engineer after building a bridge. It applies to a commander after one's unit took part in military activities. But that's an internal professional organization that investigates its own professional activities. The investigation of your own activities could be professional, strictly professional, could be legal, could be moral, could be ethical. They have all to be done, and they are actually done by the commanders. We don't, if someone finds out that some of the troops behave inappropriately and are suspects of breaching the law, then okay, let the military police investigation take place. Let that unit act, and actually there are, I don't know, 50 military police investigations going on. And nothing more is required, to my mind, because it's a very serious organization. They are very seriously interested in improving their activity on all levels: professional, military, legal, moral, ethical, and presumably they will improve their activities if they find something has gone wrong. An independent, an external independent committee is something that has become popular, but I think it not only during wars or after military operations, but in general, they do not help the forces, whether it's military or hospital or police or university or whoever, but they just weaken them. Thank you.
We'll take a series of questions. It's important to identify yourself and your organization first. Do we have microphones? We do have microphones. Please use the microphone because it's important for the transcription. No. I know you can shout, Sergio, but we need you to use the microphone for the transcription.
Okay, my name is Sergio Klein. I work for the Romanian News Agency, and I have two questions for Professor Kasher. First question is, when you refer to Lebanon, a country where Hezbollah has just joined the government but still doesn't want to give up its immense arsenal, would you advocate an extension of international law in dealing with Hezbollah, or maybe some creative solution in respect to this situation? And the second question is, you also referred to collateral damage, and you said it's in certain circumstances acceptable, when combatants are attacked. What about collateral damage when civilian infrastructure is attacked, like power stations and bridges and all these things? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I answer each one.
Yeah.
Okay. The two questions are related to each other because whenever you deal with a state, then infrastructure enters the picture. Because infrastructure is just property, it's meaningful, destroying it is meaningful, it's a sort of a pressure to be exerted on the government when you destroy part of the infrastructure of the state. Now, there are different kinds of infrastructure. If the infrastructure is used solely for military activities, that's part of the military targets. If it's used just for non-combatants, like a school or a hospital, ordinary hospital, then that's also out of the picture. However, it's something used for both purposes, like say train station. Okay, can you destroy it? Now, if you destroy it because you gain something very significant, then that's the ordinary case of creating collateral damage because you gain militarily something very important. But if it's done just for pressure, then it should not involve casualties at all. You don't kill people in order to exert pressure. You don't kill people in order to deter other people from certain activities. I mean, human life is sacred. There must be a compelling reason for killing people. If what you do is just to pressure another party, then you should find the ways of exerting that pressure and not use human beings and kill them in order to carry out your mission of exerting pressure. I mean, killing people just in order to deter people from activities is something very similar to terrorism. Terrorism means killing people or otherwise injuring them in order to frighten the population, in order for it to exert pressure on its government or on its regime, right? In our case, it's on the government to change the policies of the Israeli government. And that's wrong. Terrorism is always morally wrong. And everything which is on a par with terrorism is morally wrong. Now, if the Hezbollah start acting with us, playing with us and sending rockets and doing things like that, then there is going to be a political question that the government is going to answer. I cannot answer for them. Whether we are going to consider it as an act of state or not. I mean, we can tell the government of Lebanon, I mean, a party that participates in the government acts against us. Now, you either act against them, throw them out of the government, or stop them from attacking us, or we consider that attack an attack on your side, because you comply with it. Okay, so that the government will have to make a decision what its attitudes towards the government of Lebanon that consists of many parties, including the Hezbollah, that send rockets over us. They should make the decision. It's not something to be included in the doctrine. It's something that is included in governmental decisions.
The Minister of Defense actually have said it 2 days ago that it's going to.
David and Barbara, after David and Barbara.
David Essing, journalist. Two questions. First of all, to the best of your knowledge, Professor Kasher, could you compare the tactical conduct of the IDF during Cast Lead with the U.S. and NATO operations in Afghanistan and U.S. operations in Iraq? And secondly,
Dave, let's leave it. We have a lot of people. Okay. Let's leave it at one question.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I am delighted to answer it. There is a certain Marines operation called Phantom Fury that took place in November-December 2004 by the Marines in the town called Fallujah, which is it is near Baghdad, 75 kilometers or something like that. Now, in Fallujah, before the operation started, there were 300,000 inhabitants. Okay? There were 3,000 insurgents. in that place. Now, if you compare it to Gaza, in Gaza there is something like 1.5 million inhabitants, 5 times as many. And there were Hamas are something like 16,000, so again it's 5 times as many. Now the Marines in Fallujah killed 6,000 people, whereas we killed, according to our lists, 1,100. Even according to Palestinian lists, which are unreliable, it was 1,400. So they killed 5 times as many as we did, where the population was 5 times as smaller than ours, which means that they killed 25 times more than we did. And I'm not saying it in any way of criticizing their activities. Perhaps it was necessary. I mean, one should look into the details and find out whether it was right or wrong. But if you do compare our activities to American activities in Iraq, then you see that we were more restrained. I'll give you another example, very briefly. I read I subscribe to the US DOD messages. So I get into my email account every day some announcement made by the Department of Defense of the United States. Now every week they have conversations with a general from Iraq or Afghanistan. Now a few weeks ago there was an American general from acting in Afghanistan, who was very proud about using what we call the Nohal Shachen, neighbor regulation, which means that you ask the neighbor of the terrorist to warn that terrorist that we are going to attack him, the building, the whole structure. Our Supreme Court made a decision that this regulation is illegal. So our troops are expected not to do what that American general is very proud of doing. Okay, I think he's right. With all due respect, I mean, with our Supreme Court, I think that they were wrong. But it's the Supreme Court; it's the final decision, unless the Parliament changes it. I think they were wrong. But you see that we are restrained by the Supreme Court in this example, in a way that Americans in Afghanistan do not feel that they are restrained.
I'm Barbara Roan, Bureau Chief in Israel for Defense News and Army Times. Professor, thank you so much for this lecture. It was very enlightening. I'd like to ask 2 specific questions and then the general. The case of in the opening minutes of the Gaza campaign, the attack on the police headquarters. How, in your view, in light of what you said about the reservists being used as an instrument and their blood is no less red than a civilian or vice versa, how do you specifically justify that attack? And why didn't, using, again, your logic about military advantage versus collateral damage, why didn't Israel attack the Sheba hospital, for example, when it was clearly used as a command center for the Hamas? And then finally, sir, because of your very well justified, almost Talmudic rationale for the IDF's behavior in Gaza and what is likely to come in future conflict, why should there be an extension of international law to accomplish deal with this asymmetrical urban warfare?
Thank you for your questions. The so-called policemen, I mean, they were not intended to give tickets, to those who violate traffic regulations. First of all, in the internet you can find their expected duties. Some of them were a suicide bomber squad. Some of them were intended to be involved in rocket launching. I mean, they were not innocent people involved in traffic regulations. They were a security force of the Hamas. Actually, they were intended to take part in military activities. We know exactly who was intended to do what, and you can find it on the internet. Another aspect of hitting the police people is that In Gaza, we faced the government of Gaza. It's not a terrorist organization, like in the West Bank in the early 2000s. It's the government. Now, the government has authority over security forces, which means they can use them in order to take part in the hostilities. It's like a reserve unit, okay? It's their military reserve unit. And during warfare, you are allowed to hit reserve units that you're sure are going to enter into the battlefield. So this is why we hit them. I mean, the portrayal of those people as if they were innocent policemen is misleading, even if it's made all the time. Now, a hospital. I don't know exactly the answer. I don't know the real answer. I don't know the real answer to your question. But I assume that we told ourselves that we can manage without it, first of all. Okay? The activities on the part of those leaders of the Hamas were such that we could accomplish our missions without killing them. They were not significant for the level of activities against us. They did not raise the level of activities against us in a significant manner. One possible explanation. And second possible explanation is that's proportionality. I mean, what would we gain and what are we going to lose? We gain that probably insignificant advantage of those leaders not being able to give orders the way they do. Okay, so something very similar would have taken place had they been killed.
So
and on the other hand,
hypothetical,
that's hypothetical.
If Nasrallah, Lebanon 3, is holed up in his command center underneath a hospital in a neighborhood of Beirut, would that be justifiable for the military advantage to be gained in a hospital?
I cannot answer it because it depends on what Nasrallah is being involved right now. If there is some danger, some imminent danger stemming from Nasrallah's operations, then the answer would be yes. And if their answer is that, okay, Nasrallah is Nasrallah, but there is no imminent danger we face now because of his activities, because anyway he's in the cellar, can hardly do anything to us, and things like this, then the answer would be no. It all depends. It all depends. Now, if you kill Osama bin Laden, and you assume that would be destroying the network, or at least diminish the force of that network very significantly, then that would be justified. However, if it's just killing Osama bin Laden because he is Osama bin Laden, while it is expected there is not going to be any real advantage gained by it, then it would be wrong to destroy a hospital with all the thousands of sick persons in it because Osama bin Laden is in the cellar.
Inge Günther, Frankfurter Rundschau and Berliner Zeitung, German dailies. As far as I know, or as is known, there are right now 28 cases which are investigated by the military police of the IDF concerning the Operation Castle. All cases are also cases mentioned in the Goldstone report, some of them quite shocking. They give testimonies, as far as I heard in Eris right now, and I also interviewed some people afterwards. Cases, for example, like people being killed when raising or after raising a white flag. So, whatever, in your eyes, what would you say, are those mistakes being made, or whatever, which mistakes which happen in war? How would you classify something like that? And if it's mistakes or whatever it is, who takes responsibility for that? Is it the commander level, or are the soldiers directly the first ones who are responsible? I would like to hear your assessment.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. It will enable me to say something about Goldstone. I tried not to mention it.
We're not asking about Goldstone, but investigation
mentioned in his, you mentioned it, that those cases are mentioned in his report. But I'll answer it. There are 45, if I remember correctly, the report issued by the IDF. There are 45 investigations still going on, and there are 20 were already concluded, and there are few indictments. The figures are higher than people think. Now, evidence concerning atrocities is very problematic. And this is one aspect in which the Goldstone report is very problematic. I mean, there is the so-called evidence is very unreliable, to put it mildly. I mean, there are people who are known to be unscrupulous liars. And just recall the Jenin massacre, right? The Jenin massacre. Immediately after the operation in Jenin, the whole world spoke about Jenin massacre that killed, in which thousands of people got killed. Then there was a United Nations investigation, not an Israeli investigation, even a United Nations investigations that decreased the number by 2 orders of magnitude. Instead of thousands, it was dozens, and they were terrorists, almost all of them. So unscrupulous liars are many among our neighbors, right? Not all of them, but there is no shortage of liars in this area. Now, taking some story that a certain party tells is something that the IDF should take seriously. Not by having an external committee of investigation or sending some judge to investigate it, but by the commanders. Even if it's if it's turned out to be fabricated, even if it looks like a fabricated story, nevertheless, I mean, it's a story about your unit, investigate it. Now, those allegations of killing people who have raised white flags were investigated by the commanders, and nothing like that has been found to be true. So those are just stories. Even when you look at the first instance where they took place, made in public, you see that in the Breaking Silence soldiers document, you see that nobody says, I saw it. I heard someone who saw it, perhaps. Okay? And when you start asking them, I mean, what is the evidence? I mean, who exactly saw it? Where exactly did it happen? You don't get evidence. I mean, nothing like that. I assume that nothing like that took place, of killing people who have already raised white flags. There was a story that a woman and 2 children were allowed out of a house, and they were told to go in a certain direction. And then after they went that direction, they took that direction, the soldiers shot them, killed them. Okay? Now, that was investigated, and what was found out is that, okay, there was a soldier there who saw that the woman and the 2 children are told to get out and to go to in a certain direction. After that, he heard shots. Okay, he heard shots.
But those cases I mean the serious cases which are investigated by the IDF, not those. I mean, for sure, I agree with that. There are rumors and so on. But this case, for example, they gave testimonies short time ago, recently, just a few weeks ago. It's not concluded. It happened on the 4th of January. I have also the names of. I mean, there are serious evidence. I mean, maybe also it's wrong. I cannot judge, but I don't want to hear your assessment on those rumors, but on those cases which are even taken seriously by the IDF.
Okay, I mean, first of all, I would take seriously rumors too. I would like the commanders to investigate everything, including rumors, including silly rumors, including what is apparently fabricated rumor. Let the commander not ignore anything that is being said about his troops. That's one principle I'd like to. That's a professionally required, not only morally and ethically. That's also professionally required. I mean, there is something alleged with respect to your troops, investigate it. Secondly, when it's serious and the military police investigation unit does the investigation, then okay, let them investigate it. If there are soldiers who misbehaved, didn't behave properly, let them serve time in jail. Now, the question is who shoulders responsibility? You ask that question, whether it should be the soldier or one's commanders. That's a very good question, actually, and it depends on the circumstances. Indeed, if that was a command issued by the commander, then he should serve time in jail as well, right? If it was not his command, it was against his commands, and he did what he can to brief his troops not to be involved in such activities, then he is not responsible. He should not serve time in jail. He just improve his commandship, his commander abilities in order to guide his troops in a better way. But I'd like to make an additional remark on the area that you raised, namely soldiers being trigger happy. I mean, were there soldiers who were trigger happy? Indeed, I cannot answer the question. I mean, there are tens of thousands of soldiers. How could I know about each and every one of them? Was there some happy trigger soldier? Perhaps there was. I don't know. I cannot say definitely that there was none. However, was there a policy of trigger happiness? Here we can say that there was not. And we have two kinds of indirect evidence to that effect. First, if there was a policy of trigger happiness, there would have been thousands of Palestinian casualties. Thousands. Not 1100s, but 11,000s. Because there were so many soldiers there. So many guns that could have been operated. And so many Palestinians there. Trigger happiness would have meant tens of thousands of casualties. Moreover, a more sophisticated argument. Look at the internal distribution of casualties. If you're trigger happy, and most of the people will get killed because you're trigger happy, then the distribution of men, women, and children among the casualties will be very similar to the distribution in the population. Okay? If you just shoot into a market, okay, then you shoot into a market. It's a population. There are men and women there. And if half are men and half are women among the people, then there should have been half men, half women among the casualties. If children in Gaza are the majority, children in Gaza Strip are the majority. Now, if you are just trigger happy, and soldiers had a policy of trigger happiness, then the majority of casualties should have been children. However, that's not the case. That's not the case. The vast majority of casualties are men. Women and children consist of 200 among the 1100. A small minority. My heart aches about each of those 200s. I mean, let me use the opportunity to say it. I mean, each one of them. I mean, I'm very sorry that they got killed. And I think the IDF should improve its methods, to use even better methods, more methods of warning, more accurate weaponry. I mean, we used more than 80% of the weaponry was precise, with smart bombs and things like this. Bomb with the GPS, okay, that it hits the target. Okay, it's like a GPS, like a good GPS that when we use it in our cars. So let them devise additional methods. Let them devise methods and weaponry that would cause less collateral damage. That's a constant effort that must be made. However, those women and children were a small minority of the casualties, which shows that trigger happiness did not take place.
There's also one additional point, if I might add.
If I might add, there's one additional point that you might add in your report. In paragraph 440 of the Goldstone mission, they state very clearly, I'd like to quote from paragraph 440, that the mission it notes that those interviewed in Gaza appeared reluctant to speak about the presence or the conduct of hostilities by what they call Palestinian armed groups. So whatever the reason for the reluctance, the mission doesn't discount the interviewee's reluctance that it may have stemmed from fear of reprisals. That's a quote from the commission. In other words, the context of the evidence that is the base of your question comes in the context of the mission's noting that many of that evidence may have been tainted by the fear of reprisal by Hamas against those who have been interviewed if they had noted that there was Hamas activity in the area.
I'm only interested in those cases really investigated by the IDF.
No, but that's an important contextual part of the investigation going on by the IDF.
Yeah, I was not asking about Goldstone.
I don't experience any reluctance with respect to the IDF investigating every story. Each and every story should be investigated. I mean, by the commander, in order to find out how the troops behave. I don't have any problem with those alleged stories and rumors being investigated by the commanders.
Sir, would you mind the bit about...
Barbara, we're going to have to...
Okay, there was one question that remained unanswered, and that was why there needs to be an extension of...
Sorry. Okay, briefly put, I spoke about it in my presentation. International law was carved to guide military activities under the circumstances of the great classical wars of a military force against a military force of one state against a military force of another state.
I understand, but why would it be to the IDF's advantage to have a codified extension that specifically deals with asymmetrical warfare when the interpretation now and your ethical code seems to be more advantageous to work within those gaps that you discussed?
Put very simply, when we look into the mirror, we want to see someone moral, someone who behaved properly. I mean, we want to know what is allowed and what is forbidden, what is moral and what is immoral when we act militarily in that gap. Okay? So we need to extend international law to that gap.
I'm a guy working for NHK, Japanese television. The question is, how do you think Israel can fix or correct its image in the international community, in the eyes of the international community? After all, what you said, it's not really, in many places it's not really accepted, so what Israel should do and can do?
Okay, that's not my field of expertise, diplomacy and media wars. What I'd like to recommend is, from my point of view, is that Israel be very precise and clear and open-minded about its principles. Okay. In a sense, I mean, and we are an old nation, so we should have patience. Your clients are also an old nation, they would understand it. I mean, there are two kinds of international law. There is the when states sign certain conventions, and there is the customary international law. Okay, customary international law is an developing customary international law is an historical process. Okay, so if the states involved in a certain type of military activity against terroristic organizations, militias, and the like, I mean, if all of them act quite similarly to each other, then there is a chance that it will become customary international law. Okay. Now signing, the ICRC putting forward a new convention concerning those circumstances, United States and Israel didn't sign the additional protocols, 1977 additional protocols. There is no chance that the ICRC is going to come up with a convention that is going to be signed and ratified by everyone. Okay. So that convention, international law, is not the right venue. The right venue is that of customary international law, but that takes time. So I don't assume that the world will say, okay, Israel is the leader in customary international law, let all us follow Israel. Okay, it's Israel, it's Jews, the world is not going to follow them. However, if the United States and the United Kingdom and Germany and Canada and Italy and Poland and the Netherlands and Israel and Russia and other states that are involved in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Israel, in the Palestinian areas, and Chechnya and those places, if all of them are going to use similar principles to similar situations, that has a chance, a very significant chance of becoming customary international law. So what we say presently is very ambitious. Our doctrine, so we believe, give and take some amendments, is going to become customary international law.
Please join me in thanking Professor Asa Kasher for a wonderful session. Thank you all for making, those of you who made the long trip from Tel Aviv and its environs, thank you. And we are hopefully, we'll see you next on December the 10th, when we expect to have General Moshe Kaplinsky, who was the former head of our Northern Command, who will be speaking about relevant topics in the North. Thank you.